Yeah, I'll leave for Rochester on Sunday. My brother lives there, and then I'll stay there and hopefully have more appointments and stuff during the week and celebrate Thanksgiving with him. And I think he has to work quite a bit because they're short-staffed too, like a lot of hospitals, and so probably come back by Friday-ish. For Jill and your name? Brenda. Do you guys know what the book is? Okay, very good. So usually I recommend people bring the book, at least sometimes their Bible. This week is kind of our second week of introduction, so next week we'll start with the text of the book. I tend to follow the commentary. I'll follow the divisions in the commentary, but usually I add to it and kind of develop it. I also like to give people questions to kind of talk about at your tables, because part of it, I try to convince people of this all the time, is that I don't have all of the answers and I don't know all of the questions. I'll say I don't know quite a bit when you ask. Part of my goal is to help you learn how to read the Bible better, how to encounter it, how to ponder things, how to look them up. And that means that you have to do some of the work and you have to crunch on it and chew on it. So usually I give you a set of questions to answer. If you were with my Tuesday morning group, they would say they're kind of thinking questions. Sarah has lots of experience. She's used to it. If you look at, I'd be happy to share with you the older notes from John or Mark or some of the other ones, but you can see that usually there's a pretty thick stack of questions, and they tend to be things that you have to think about. Not just, what does the Bible say? I mean, I could ask you that until you're blue in the face. Like, Acts chapter 1, verse 1 says what? To me, that's not really helpful. But it'll be stuff like, why do you think Acts addresses the book to Theophilus, who is the person that the book is addressed to? Like, why that? Do you think it's a real person? It could be, but Theophilus also means a lover of God. So it could be a kind of performative name that it's addressed to anyone who loves God. Do you think it's a person, or do you think it's, do you think it's more of a group or a collective thing? The answer that I would give is there's nothing that prevents it from being both. Last time we talked a little bit about sort of an overview of the Old Testament. We did a gunshot overview of the Old Testament. It was quite the commentary. I think we made it all the way to the end of the Old Testament. The book of Acts situates itself like there's the life of Jesus in the four Gospels. He dies and he rises. And then the Gospel of Luke ends with the road to Emmaus. And then Jesus talks to the disciples for a little bit, and then he ascends into heaven, and the book just kind of stops. Acts will pick up like right there at that place. Jesus is ascending into heaven. I think it repeats that a little bit at the beginning of Acts, and then it'll talk about the story of Pentecost and the apostles. And it doesn't have quite the same flavor of the Gospels, so it'll be really interesting. For most of my Bible studies, I've been doing Gospels. I don't know what Acts is going to be like. This book is bigger and thicker than the ones were for the Gospels. So it'll be kind of exciting. I'm going to be learning along with you, and I'm looking forward to that. I do know that Acts, so the Gospel of Luke kind of takes us from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Bethlehem, where Jesus is born at the beginning. He wanders around, goes to Galilee for a while, ends up in Jerusalem. The book of Acts will take us from Jerusalem. Do you know where it ends? Anyone know where the book of Acts ends? Rome. Yeah. The book of Acts will take us from Jerusalem. It will follow Paul around on his adventures for a while and follow a few apostles. But eventually we get in a boat with Paul and we sail over to Rome. And then it ends with Paul's imprisonment in Rome. So it's going to be exciting. It's a bit of an adventure. That's the direction that it will go. We're going to talk about a few of the background pieces today that you have to remember. Because part of it is we have to recall that Jesus lives in a world without stuff like light switches. We kind of have to let go of modern English brain and try and get like biblical Hebrew brain. Because, we think of things like, oh yeah, Paul went on a missionary journey. Whatever, it's a little while. And it's like, yeah, he sails on a boat. He gets shipwrecked 3 times. I've never wanted to be shipwrecked, but like clinging to the wood like you see in the movie with the waves smashing you, shipwrecked 3 times. It's a journey of some months, if not years. And he crosses highlands, and he has to go here, and he has to go there, and sometimes people like him, and sometimes they don't. So there's all of these things that we have to remember about like traveling and food. And one of the biggest things when it comes to food, so in the Middle East, in Israel, 2 crops are the most important: olives and grapes. Olives and grapes. Olives were used for oil and lots of other things. People ate them. And grapes. And grapes were used to make wine. Why is wine making important? This is a sociological question, good sociological question, but there's a good reason why. It's also related to the modern invention that I think would be one of the hardest to live without. She cheated. She knows my answer to this. Refrigeration. Winemaking and beer making are actually related to fermentation, but why would you do it? For preservation. They preserve most of the nutritional value of the grains that are used in making them. And in a world without refrigeration, that's extremely important because they're stable at room temperature. They become more concentrated, so in the ancient world, when you were wine drinking, you always mixed it with water. Because, like in Israel, so Israel is a hot climate, not a cold climate. That's another thing that we have to reframe in our brains. Like, you don't cover up because you're cold. You do things because you're hot. Like, shade is important, not so much heat. You have plenty of heat usually and not enough shade. But these things would be stable at warmer temperatures, but they would evaporate. So whatever you started with winemaking, over time becomes stronger and stronger and more concentrated. The alcohol content increases pretty dramatically. But that's one of the reasons why they did it, is it preserves the nutritional value of grain over time. It also helps that there's alcohol in it and people enjoy that. But nonetheless, there is a real defined sociological, anthropological purpose for some of those things. It's easy to miss. So they grow olives and grapes. Those are 2 important crops. Olive grows on trees, rather slow growing trees. Grapes grow on vines. Their meals, they often ate fruit and vegetables, bread, milk products, and fish. Meat is relatively rarely eaten. Why do you think meat is relatively rarely eaten? There's no preservation. So it's not so hard to eat a chicken, right? Because that's not all that large. But what do you do with a cow? You start thinking of it and you realize that there's much more of a sacrifice in making meat, because other than, even if you cook it, it's hard to save without refrigeration. You can smoke it, so you can turn it into a kind of jerky. You can sort of get all of the water out of it in various ways, and that would help preserve it. That would keep it safe from things. But the issue of food is huge. And it's changed very, very dramatically by this invention of refrigeration. Fruits, dates, pomegranates, grapes, olives, figs. I think they had tomatoes. Vegetables, beans, lentils, cucumbers. There's a few of them that you have to think of. I'm pretty sure they had carrots too. Squash and its relatives, pumpkins, those things are native to North America. Corn, I don't remember the genealogical history of corn, because I know maize is native to North America and Mexico, but I don't know if corn has more than one ancestor. Some of them do, where they arose in more than one place. Wheat was certainly common, barley, most of the small grains were cultivated in the ancient Middle East, but some of them, like potatoes. Potatoes are actually from South America. They were cultivated first by the Incas and the peoples that came before them in the mountains of South America, so they didn't have potatoes. Rice, I don't think they had, even though rice has been cultivated since ancient times, but I don't think there was enough commerce all the way. I don't know even where the origin of rice is. Southeast Asia somewhere, I'm guessing. China, Vietnam, somewhere around there, likely.
How would you grow it in the desert anyway?
How would you what?
How would you grow rice in the desert?
Well, so this is one of the things that we do have to talk about. We're going to talk about landforms in a little bit and landscape, because we think of Israel as a desert and it's not. Parts of it are, but not the whole thing. Meat is not super common, but they did eat chicken and lamb. Lamb, especially at Passover, every year you had to eat lamb at least once for Passover, and beef, but not pork. Gentile places would eat pork, but the Jews did not. Societal positions. This is another thing that you just kind of have to flip your brain inside out on, because they live in a culture that we call more of a subsistence culture, which means that most of the energy in society is involved in food production. So there aren't a lot of service industries that more people, more jobs, more prosperity, more livelihoods are much closer tied to food production than our culture now. Like now we live in a society where food production is very minimal, especially in Fargo. None of you are probably involved in food production. Maybe Kim a little bit, but I don't think any of the rest of us are, right? We have services, but in ancient Israel, you have a large group of people. Most of society is involved in food production. The merchants and the classes of people that would do services, that would provide goods, marketers, merchants, that kind of thing, is a significantly smaller group. The nobility is tiny, maybe like 0.5% or 1% of society, and then you have part of that would be wealthy landowners who had a household, maybe multiple estates, and then you have a king kind of on top of the social hierarchy. They live in a world where slavery is common. Not slavery like there is in the United States. It wasn't racial in the ancient world. Much of it came from wars. When wars were fought, the losers were often taken as slaves to live in the place of the winners. Slavery was much more of a social class, and it wasn't looked down upon in society. It wasn't bad to be a slave. In much of the Roman Empire, around 30% of the population was slaves. And it was actually better to be a slave in a lot of cases than a poor landowner, because a slave was attached to a household. They were property and they could be sold, and yes, there are evils to that, but they were attached to a household that had a vested interest in their survival. If you were a poor landowner and you died, no one cared, because it was you and not necessarily for anyone else. There are poor landowners and laborers. They spend most of their time and work in food production. There are merchants. They traded rather widely. It's fascinating to know just how developed trade routes are. Like, they find stuff, they're not common, but they find things like jade artifacts, which were from China, in places like the ancient Middle East. That was a journey of 6 months or 8 months, 10 months in one direction. To get them out of China, you had to cross the Himalayas and vast deserts to do it, and they did. Because they didn't sail like around the southern tip of India. They didn't have ocean-going ships in the same way, or of the same size that we would have in later society. So most of it was done by land. But there were developed trade routes. So there are some merchants. Life is dangerous, especially outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Bandits were common, people that just raided trade caravans. Society was a lot more brutal than we are used to now. In Israel, there are priests and Levites. They're moving into the upper classes. They certainly were a service group. They're not attached to landowning in the same way. They take care of the temple. And then there's the nobility and the ruling class. Houses. Let's look at some pictures. If you flip to the middle pages, I put some examples of houses into the handout, because when you hear of like Jesus and Mary and Joseph living in a house, or the apostles go to a house, you wonder a little bit what it looked like. So people lived much closer on top of each other. The major building material is stone, not wood. They don't have very much wood at all, so they use it in a few places, like you can see in the second one, but it's not very common. You can see, so the middle picture especially would be a relatively poor family. This house is done on 2 levels, which was quite common. On the bottom level, you have a place where your local animals were kept. People often had some kind of animal for milk, either sheep or a cow. They often had some chickens. The middle room is used for storing pots. I don't know what the one on the left is. That might be for cooking. And then on the second level was where people lived. Their homes were very small. This thing might only be 15 or 20 feet wide at most. You know, and a family of 5 or 10 might very easily live in it. So people didn't have stuff like bedrooms in the same way that we do until you get into the homes of the nobility. One thing that's very different about their houses is that the roof is used quite often. Like the roof is flat usually, and sometimes they build like a canopy or something on it, but it's used all the time. It's like a part of the house, where we have roofs that are basically worthless. We put shingles on them and pay lots of money to replace our shingles when it hails. In the Middle East, even today in the modern world, the roof of their house is often where you have guests, like it's a patio. Partially because it's a warmer climate, but you know, like that's a just feature of their house. So you have to be ready for that, because some things happen on the roof of houses, and it's not like ours with, you know, sharp points. The bottom house, I think, is a reconstruction of one that was actually found. Based on the ruins and the stuff, you know, you could see some steep stairs going up on the right side. If you flip the page over to page 5, this is an example of one that would be a little bit wealthier, a little bit up the social chain, but maybe not too much, because one of the things that is very different about them is that you rarely lived just with your own family, like your own immediate family. Family groups were much larger, aunts, uncles, grandparents. There were often a whole group of people living together. You can see that the animals are kept in a room just inside the door. And then there's various other rooms. You can kind of see there's steps going up where you would have the roof, but they cut out so you can see the inside of some of the rooms. Note that their big fire for cooking is outside, not inside. Inside was already hot enough because of the climate, so they did most of their cooking when they could outside. I put in a couple examples where you can look at some videos of like 1st century Nazareth village, where they have some things that show you can see like an olive press and some of the ways that they did things. Some of that are great things to look at on YouTube, because it really gives context and flavor to some of it. In Israel, the climate tends to be very warm. In much of the Middle East, the climate is warm, but most of the Middle East that isn't a desert does have a rainy season. So here we have like hot summer, cold winter. There they have hot summer, rainy winter. It's cooler, not cold usually. So Israel is often in the 60s, but that's when it rains. So rain is much more seasonal than we're used to. It rains very rarely in the summer, but in the winter, in Galilee, for instance, there's about a 30% chance of rain on a given day. That's the most common, that it rains quite frequently. So the landscape of Israel, we're going to talk about this, and then we have to talk about some of the other places too. The landscape of Israel is a coastal plain along the Mediterranean, so a relatively broad, flat coastal plain that's relatively well watered with rivers and different things, gets some moisture. A lot of crops are grown there. A lot of cities are found in the coastal plain. As you move toward the east, you get into what's called the Judean highlands. They're relatively hills. If you're from North Dakota, you would call them mountains. They're often 1,000 feet tall, like up and down. If you go to Israel today, you see this very readily. Like you're driving toward Jerusalem and you see the Judean highlands. They're quite, for us, they would be very, very significant hills. You don't want to do a lot of walking. You don't travel north and south through the highlands. You go east toward the Jordan River Valley, or you go west toward the coastal plain, because it's much more pleasant walking. Walking up and down 1,000-foot hills doesn't work. It's quite trying, and trying to get a horse or a mule up the hill pulling a cart is probably worthless. In the east, in Israel, the Jordan River Valley, which is in the east of Jerusalem, so Jerusalem's up at about 2,000 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea is 2,200 to 2,600 feet below sea level, so it's about a 4,000 foot decline from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. And once you get to Jerusalem, it's kind of on the eastern edge of the Judean highlands. It turns into a desert very, very quickly. Very, very dry. It's called the Judean wilderness. Jericho is there, but Jericho is at a place where there's a natural spring. That's why it's able to be there, because there's a source of fresh water. And then the Jordan River is in the bottom of a river valley. If you go east of there into the country of Jordan, there's a coast, there's like a broad plain close to the Jordan River, and then very, very quickly it goes uphill several thousand feet, kind of like Israel. So if you want to travel north and south in Israel, you either go over to the coastal plain in the west or the Jordan River Valley in the east. Even the Sea of Galilee is below sea level. It's about, is it 30 or 40 feet, maybe 100 feet below sea level is the surface of the Sea of Galilee, and it goes downhill to the Dead Sea. Galilee as an area is much hillier. It goes downward toward the Sea of Galilee. Like, for most of my life, I thought of the Sea of Galilee like on this broad, flat, like North Dakota-like thing. Not at all. Its banks are about 1,000 feet tall, and they come down relatively rapidly, and there's only a few hundred yards of relatively flat area along the sea between the hills and the sea. And it's like that most of the way around, except on the very southern end. So you have to, like, I had to reframe, like, seeing the Sea of Galilee, it was like, I've never thought of it this way. So you picture big giant hills and then water in the middle. Looks a little bit more like mountain lakes in the United States than, like this Minnesota lake that isn't surrounded by trees and has this broad, flat area around it. It's not really like that. So that's Israel. The southern part of Israel is a desert. It's called the Negev. It's one of the driest places on earth. There's some interesting things there. We can talk about them later because we have to get to the Jewish and Gentile world. If you go north of Israel, Lebanon is relatively hilly and mountainous and wet. They have a fairly nice climate. It's actually one of the paradise places on earth when it's not being ruled by idiots and having infighting. There's 3 major ethnic groups in Lebanon, and it's always tense between them. East of Lebanon and north of there is the country of Syria. Syria is much warmer, much more desert-like, except for the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Mesopotamia, but the area between the rivers is relatively well watered because the two rivers are quite large. But outside of that, Syria is much drier. And then you reach one of the major land features that is going to be with us in the book of Acts, which is called the Anatolian Plateau. This is most of the country of Turkey. Again, there's a sort of flat area along the coast, but very quickly it goes uphill, and it's relatively flat once you're on top, like plateaus, but I think it's several thousand feet. There are going to be some hills. It's a relatively dry landscape, warm summers, cool winters, usually close to freezing, they think, in central Turkey. Paul will visit there. You can see on the map, I have a map that I put one of Paul's missionary journeys. So the area of Pisidia between Antioch and Lystra, Iconium and Derbe, that's all in the Anatolian Plateau, the highlands. Cappadocia and Cilicia in the east are much more mountainous and drier. There I think the mountains start getting up to 10,000, 12,000 feet. As you go into Bithynia and Thyatira in the west, that area is flatter, at least along the Mediterranean, along the coast where Ephesus is. But I think there too you start going uphill relatively quickly. In Greece, Macedonia, the northern part of Greece, is relative highlands, lots of granite, very beautiful cliffs. You can look at the monasteries of Meteora. That's a pretty cool place. They built these monasteries on top of these giant granite pillars. You have to like travel up these weird staircases to get all the way up to the top. Paul will go to Macedonia. That's where Thessalonica is. Philippi is there. Many of those. As you go toward Athens in Achaia, the land is still somewhat rocky but flatter, a little bit more suited to civilization and inhabitants. And then Corinth is on an island. Forget the name of that island. I think that's relatively flat, good land, olives, grapes, those kinds of things. So the landscape will be important to us in this book. How are we doing for time? Oh boy. Trying to think. Okay, well, we're going to get through what we get through. Travel is often on foot or by horse or donkey. Probably not donkeys too much because donkeys don't like to move all that much, or mules especially, but horses, the Romans certainly traveled around by horses, horse-drawn carts, but the major route that you would take if you could is boats. They rarely sailed directly across the Mediterranean even. The Israelites are certainly not good seafarers. They're not a seafaring land or people. But in the ancient world, they were much more concerned about winds and trade winds, so they would sail from the western part of the Mediterranean to the east. I think it's in the early spring and summer, and they would sail west in the fall and winter because that's the way the major winds were blowing. They tended to stay closer to the coast. I mean, they certainly do sail across large expanses of water, but they don't have the same kind of skill in boating that some of the other cultures do. They don't usually just sail directly across the Mediterranean. It was too dangerous, too easy to get shipwrecked. But they do, as often as they can, they travel by boat because it's far faster. I think they talk about the rule of sevens. So what you can cross in 7 days on foot takes 1 day by horse, and what you cross in 7 days by horse takes 1 day on a boat. Give or take. It's something like that. So the ability to travel is quite significant. Traveling takes a long time. Even to go from Galilee to Jerusalem is a journey probably of 3 to 5 days, if not a week, in each direction. I think it's about 60 miles. So 20-mile days if you're walking, those are pretty big days. The people were more used to it, but we'll have to remember that because there's a lot of traveling in the book of Acts. We're going to move around a lot. Clothing tended to be long and modest, particularly for women, but part of it is also practical. Because it's a hot culture, it is actually better to have large flowing robes without stuff close to your skin. They say, even if you go now, like if you would travel to the Middle East now or Saudi Arabia where it's 110 or 120 or whatever, you basically have to get rid of your concept of underwear, because if you try and wear it, you will be like full of sweat all the time and dripping wet. Because what actually is much cooler is you have to get your clothing away from your skin. Because it traps a layer of air, which we think of as usually being warmer, but in this case, because the sun is trying to murder you, it's cooler.
Brings a new thought to desert sheets.
But it is one of the reasons why actually, and you see this in some of the modern survival shows, that if they put people out in the desert, one of the first things you want to do is cover up, because the sun is more dangerous than being hot. It'll burn you, your skin will blister. Actually, I should have put that on here. Most people probably had dark to olive colored skin. White people would not be real present. Even into Greece, once you get into Europe and Northern Europe, you'd get more of that. But Jesus having white skin, the chances are about 1 in a trillion. He probably had basically jet black hair and dark or olive colored skin, like dark burnished bronze colored skin. Mostly because if you look at Jewish people today and their family lineage is Jewish, they almost all have jet black hair and fairly dark colored skin. It's just genetic, but also the area of the world that they live in. This is one of the most important distinctions what's coming next. The Jewish versus the Gentile world. We're going to have to move between this a lot in the book of Acts. The difference between Jewish world and Gentile world. So Jewish world is the world of the biblical covenant. Gentile world is a world of paganism. Jews have one God, the Gentiles have many gods. The worship of God in the Old Testament is with sacrifices of various kinds of animals that are prescribed. There are some sacrifices that weren't animals. They offer bread mixed with oil. They have several other ones. They have some drink ones, but for the most part it's animal sacrifices of clean animals and prayer, psalms, praying out loud, those kinds of things. Gentile worship is still prayers, but prayers repeated. In the Gentile world, you kind of have to get the God's attention because the gods don't really care about you. They're these sort of immortal beings that do dumb things all the time. And so you have to sort of wildly get their attention. So they talk about repeating prayers like on and on and on for 8 hours or 10 hours to get them to possibly listen to you once. There are sacrifices that are offered. Meat is sacrificed